Jesse James was the lad that killed many a man. He robbed the Danville train. But the mean little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave. Poor Jesse had a wife to mourn for his life, 3 children.
Hello and welcome to Verbal Exchange, the podcast about translators and translating. My name is Steve Eaton. Today we're going to do something different. Instead of talking about a work in translation, we're going to discuss a new novel entitled Peter Pegg, Outlaw, by One Who Knew Him, written by the American writer Jonathan Eaton. I should perhaps point out that Mr. Eaton is my brother, and I'm fortunate to have him sitting here with me in the studio located high on the 99th floor of the Verbal Exchange Tower. Hello, Jonathan, and welcome.
Thanks. I'm very excited to be doing this.
Now, one of the things that I find interesting about Peter Pegg, Outlaw, is that it re-examines some of the events of the first 2 novels in the trilogy, but from a different perspective and in a different voice from the other 2. A Good Man for an Outlaw is told from the point of view of the ghost of a semi-literate outlaw who's just been killed and is trying to figure out what's going to happen to his soul. Outlaws and Worse is told in a more traditional third-person narrator style. But with Peter Pegg, you do something still different. It's written in the style of a turn-of-the-century, sensationalized, true account of the life of an outlaw by the lawman who manages to capture him. And I'm just curious about what led you to take this approach.
So, there are 3 main reasons for that. And having said there are 3 main reasons, I'll try and think of 3 reasons. The first is simply that the universe of ways of writing a novel is vast and life is short, and I just wanted to experiment some with different ways of approaching writing a novel. And I would say that was probably 80% of the motivation for doing it 3 different ways. But also, while I'm a fan of series, and I loved C.S. Lewis's Narnia series and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and Asimov's Foundation series. Those works are really taken together one big book, and I kind of wanted my novels to have lives of their own and not be kind of chained together like prisoners in a chain gang.
Okay, all right.
And then finally, I've always kind of been fascinated with chunks of things that may or may not be related, like you would find in an archaeological dig. And my feeling is that that's probably what attracts archaeologists to their profession is, digging something up and then digging something else up and seeing if the two do these 2 things fit together? Do they, taken together, do they tell a story? Do they tell a story of their own? And I kind of liken that to, Venus de Milo, who's dug up without, she doesn't have any arms, right? And she just enraptured the whole world. And something that I don't think you hear very often about Venus de Milo is that they didn't just, when they found her, they didn't just quit digging. They didn't just figure, oh, this is nice, and go on to somewhere else. They dug around because they thought they might find something else. And sure enough, they found
arms.
The arm, right. And they found an arm. And did you know they found an arm?
No, I didn't. That question had never occurred to me.
Well, yeah, they found an arm, but you never hear about it, right? You kind of have to wonder why it isn't kind of leaning up against the statue in the whatever museum it's in, right? They should have her arm there. Well, it's not 100% clear that it is her arm. But it's probably, I think most experts would say that's her arm. And that arm has a hand attached holding an apple. It's probably the apple of discord. What's called the apple of discord, if you know that story. Anyway, and as Stowe would say, that's another story. But that's kind of what I'm going for there, are these objects that are associated but each have their own story to tell.
Were you inspired by a purportedly true account of an outlaw's career? I'm thinking of something like Pat Garrett's account of Billy the Kid.
Yes, and in fact, Pat Garrett's Billy the Kid, I would say, is the main inspiration for this story, for writing the story in this particular fashion. And the sub-story of Jeffrey Noonan's life was in large part inspired by John Wesley Hardin's autobiography, and also that of Cole Younger. And what I found interesting about accounts that outlaws wrote about themselves in that time period, and probably historically, is that they never did anything wrong. And that was the approach that I wanted to take with Noonan's story, that he was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. He was always defending himself.
When we know from the story that he's done some pretty awful things.
That's right.
People.
I'd like to read the full title of the novel from the frontispiece. Peter Pegg, Outlaw, by One Who Knew Him. A complete and unvarnished history of the bloody career of that infamous outlaw known to the world as Peter Pegg, though to his mother as Matthew Mulkey, as told by Daniel Earnshaw, a Texas lawman in that time and place known to all who thrill to true stories of adventure as the Wild West, with illustrations by Mr. Thomas Sale. Now that's a wonderful title. It has a nice period flavor, but I understand it led to problems during the publication process, and I thought our readers might be interested into hearing what happened there.
So I'm what's used to be called self-published, but we now prefer the title indie publisher.
Right.
And Amazon provides a process for indie publishers called, the process is KDP. I think it stands for Kindle Direct Publishing or something like that. Anyway, it's entirely automated and it's entirely free, which is great for somebody like me who doesn't sell a lot of books. And I rarely interact with actual human beings. But there are algorithms that kind of keep an eye on the process as I move my book through. And because it's not clearly stated, and intentionally not clearly stated, either on the cover or in the frontispiece, who the actual author is, the algorithm caught me and said that it wasn't going to publish this book until I corrected the list of authors that I had given in my submission of the novel. So it did provide, however, an email to an actual person or group of people that I could clarify myself to. So I sent them a very brief email explaining that I was indeed the author, that I had correctly listed myself as the author in the submission. And
that you weren't trying to pass this off as the actual true story written by a lawman?
I didn't go that far. But in any case, after a few days, I got an email back that everything was straightened out and that I could proceed. So all's well that ends well.
Peter Pegg, Outlaw, is really a novel within a novel, because the narrator, the retired lawman Daniel Earnshaw, frames his story within the story of being approached by a publisher named Sam Stowe to write an authentic account of this famous event, the ambush at Brushy Bottom Creek. And some of the funniest parts of what is really a very funny book, at least for me, have to do with the arguments between Earnshaw and Stowe over what should or shouldn't be included in the story. Stowe clearly sees an opportunity for a runaway bestseller, and he seems to be mainly concerned with assuring readers that their expectations will be satisfied. But Earnshaw almost has a compulsion to get sidetracked into entertaining side stories, which, at least initially, don't seem connected to the main story. And I feel like Earnshaw and Stowe represent two sides of your authorial impulses, like you're wrestling with your enjoyment of telling tall tales while still feeling the necessity of getting on with the main thread of the story. Have I touched on something there?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right. I don't ever suffer from writer's block. I should probably knock on wood. In fact, I suppose I suffer from the opposite, which you might call writer's spew. And I do often have that internal conversation in my head about whether or not something ought to be kept or cut. And as all writers know, it's difficult to kill your babies. And it was nice to externalize that as a conversation between Earnshaw and Stowe over what should or should not be included in the novel.
Okay, now for me, the most striking instance of the conflict between Earnshaw, who is telling the story, and his publisher, Sam Stowe, has to do with two illustrations that Earnshaw wants to include in the book. Would you mind reading this passage, which is the conversation between the two about a chapter that Earnshaw has written called Boyd Stork, in his own words, that Sam Stowe wants to leave out of the book because he doesn't think it has to, it's related closely enough to the main story.
Upon reviewing the completed rough draft of this work, Sam came to the conclusion, regretfully, he claimed, that though Boyd Stork's story was a tale as uplifting as it was tragic, and as instructive as it was gruesome, it did not bear directly enough upon our subject and must be cut. So the long hours I spent talking to the old drunk and chronicling his adventures, not to mention the paper and ink expended, will come to nothing, I said. It will be a better book for it, Sam said. I have already commissioned, paid for, and received 2 illustrations for the chapter. I'm afraid there is nothing to be done about that, Sam said. We will excise the chapter if you feel we must, I said, but I will not consign Mr. Sale's brilliant illustrations to the waste bin. What will you do with them? Exactly what I intended to do when I paid for them. You mean to have them in the book without any context whatsoever? Yes. Sam Stowe stomped and fumed and quoted Shakespeare at me, and not the nice parts either. But I held firm. You are a stubborn old mule, Sam said when he saw I would not be moved. Never in all my days, in all my years in the book publishing trade, have I ever heard of such foolishness, and I want my strenuous objections made clear to the reader. I hope the above suffices, my dear friend.
Thank you. And sure enough, in the book, that passage is followed by 2 strange and wonderful illustrations that have no discernible relation to the story. And I have to ask you, did you actually write the story that ends up getting fictionally deleted, or did you just decide to throw that in so you had an excuse to have a funny story and 2 spurious illustrations?
I did actually write the life story of Boyd Stork. And that story is about 10,000 words. And if it had been part of the novel, that would have comprised about 10% of the entire novel would be Boyd Stork's life story. But there is something I would like to read you, which I think you'll find this interesting.
Is this part of the Boyd Stork story that got left out?
Yes. Okay, here it is. So, Boyd Stork's story, take that, Sam. I'm going to get to include this story anyway. Boyd Stork's story is in large part based on an autobiography by Reverend Daniel Baker, D.D., an autobiography he published in 1858. And it's called The Life and Labors of Reverend Daniel Baker, D.D., pastor and evangelist. And here's just one short paragraph from his book, and I want to set this up a little bit. He's a traveling preacher, and he travels around and saves people's souls. And whenever he saved a soul, he would have this person sign a contract, and he claims to have boxes and boxes full of these signed contracts, so he can count how many souls he's saved. And according to the Reverend Baker, it was common in towns that he visited as a form of amusement for men to get together and get drunk and make fun of traveling evangelists. So this is a paragraph about one of those meetings. I was told that a mock prayer meeting was held on Friday, and the very week before I reached Washington, an incident of an awful kind took place, which ought to have struck terror into every heart, but did not. While the mock meeting was going on, whilst one, half drunk, was mimicking a certain preacher, and all present were laughing immoderately, a pistol in the hand of one accidentally went off, and one of the number, pierced in the heart, fell dead upon the floor. So sudden was the death, the features not having time to relax, that the body, when shrouded, presented the unnatural and fearful spectacle of a laughing corpse.
Oh, man.
So, that's very rich
Material. Yes.
Yeah, and reading that, I have to wonder about certain phrases he uses. Whilst one, half drunk, was mimicking a certain preacher. Well, of course, you have to wonder who that certain preacher was, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're wondering who the preacher was, naturally, one wonders in whose hand was the pistol that accidentally went off, right? So anyway, it's a nice story.
So what you're telling me is there's a story there.
There is a story there, yeah.
Now, I know you did a lot of research into the history of frontier life in the late 1800s as you were writing this novel, and there's so much fascinating period detail in the book involving everything from Shakespearean theater on the frontier, shoemaking, steam engines, magic shows, vigilante mobs, medical practices, circuses, and so forth. And, I think the reader is frequently left thinking, wait, did that really happen? Was it really like that? And of course, all is fair in love and war and novel writing if it goes into making a good story. But I'm only human, and I'm very curious about what is invention and what is inspired by something you came across while you were doing research into the period. And just as an example, one of the funniest and strangest episodes for me involves a magic show that's being put on in a small Texas town. I'm wondering if you could read a passage about one part of that magic show.
Even as we were applauding and hooting, Mr. Potomac picked up the chopsticks and walked over to where, we now only noted, there was a shelf at about shoulder height, upon which were arranged 7 patent medicine bottles, each filled to a different level with a bright blue liquid. Using the chopsticks, Mr. Potomac expertly played renditions of various well-known tunes to the great delight of the audience. He then returned to the table, set down the chopsticks, and picked up one of the 7 pistols. He aimed the pistol at the bottles, cocked it. We grew silent in anticipation, but he did not fire the pistol. Rather, he threw it up into the air, and before he caught it, had taken up the next pistol, cocked it, and thrown it up into the air as well, and continued in that manner until he had 7 cocked pistols circling in the air before him, his hands moving as rapidly and invisibly as the wings of a hummingbird. At the report of a pistol, the first of the bottles shattered. A second report, a second bottle was destroyed, and so on and so forth. Mr. Potomac hit his mark with every shot, save the last. We chuckled at the mishap. Mr. Potomac caught his pistols one after the other, set them back on the table, then turned towards us. He did not look amused in the least. I first witnessed this delightful demonstration of dexterity while traveling in Japan, he said, courtesy of a fine French prestidigitator by the name of Victor Casimir d'Arville. Monsieur d'Arville claimed he was the only man on God's green earth capable of such a feat. But with a little practice, I learned to replicate it, and was soon performing it wherever I went, and with more panache, I might add, than d'Arville was ever capable of. I received a letter from d'Arville one day stating that he had heard I had stolen his act from him, and that upon opening the letter I had taken his curse, namely, that however close I might stand, however carefully I might aim, however diligently I might practice, I would never again be able to hit that 7th bottle, and my performance of the trick would forever be inferior to his. I've always felt it was rude not to reply promptly to friendly correspondence. When he opened the letter I sent him in reply, he was instantly transformed into a monkey. Mr. Potomac gave a long and hearty laugh at the prank he had played upon a fellow sorcerer, so long and hearty, in fact, that it sent chills up our spines. As he reloaded one of the pistols, he continued his story. I meant to turn him back into a man, Mr. Potomac said, once I felt he'd been properly humbled, but unfortunately he was shot and killed by a hunter before I had the chance. I purchased one of Monsieur Darville's paws from the hunter who bagged him as a memento, and I have... Just then, Mr. Potomac was interrupted by a loud knocking sound, which seemed to emanate from within the wooden box upon the table. Patience, monsieur, patience, Mr. Potomac said, turning towards the box. I was just getting to you. He placed the loaded pistol on the table, opened the box, and retrieved from it a shriveled monkey's paw. Clasping it tightly at the wrist, he held it up before us. Monsieur Darville, Mr. Potomac said to the paw, please say hello to our guests. The paw, with its hairy, human-like fingers, deeply creased palm, and thick black fingernails, came suddenly to life. We gasped as one as it waved to us. Thank you, Monsieur Darville, Mr. Potomac said to the paw. He picked up the loaded pistol and handed it to the paw turning it instantly upon Mr. Potomac. Now, Monsieur Darville, Mr. Potomac said with a nervous chuckle, we have an arrangement. You behave like a gentleman, and I allow you to share the stage with me, don't you remember? The paw turned the pistol away from Mr. Potomac, reluctantly it seemed to me. Mr. Potomac looked at us and raised his eyebrows as though to say, that was a close one. Now, Monsieur Darville, Mr. Potomac said to the paw, if you would be so kind. The paw pointed the pistol at the seventh bottle, pulled back the hammer, placed a hairy finger on the trigger, and blasted the bottle to smithereens. We applauded and hooted generously. Do you hear that, Monsieur Darville, Mr. Potomac said to the paw. They adore you. Isn't that what you live on for? The paw curled itself into a fist and nodded vigorously, continuing to do so even as Mr. Potomac returned it to the box.
That's an amazing story, and of course I have to ask, as I wonder about a lot of the stories in this novel, was that based on something you actually came across in your research? Was there an actual magic act like that?
So Mr. Potomac is based on an African-American magician by the name of Richard Potter. He was a magician in the early 19th century who gained fame in America and worldwide. And I don't remember exactly what his tricks involved. I can't tell you whether I made that up or he actually had a trick related to having a monkey's paw, but he was an interesting character. And I first ran across his name in the autobiography of an actor by the name of Yankee Hill, who also provided quite a bit of background information for Jeffrey Noonan's career as an actor.
Okay.
Now, the magic show described in the book is part of a traveling circus described by a young man who doesn't have the money to buy a ticket, so he captures a stray cat, which he offers to the circus barker in exchange for a ticket, and he suggests to the circuit barker that the cat could be fed to the circus lion as part of the circus's animal act. And somewhat to my surprise, the circus barker accepts the deal and gives the boy a ticket in exchange for the cat, which is presumably then fed to the lion. And I think you told me there's an interesting story behind that.
Yeah, and that's that actor I mentioned, that was taken pretty directly from his autobiography. That was his first experience with the circus as a young man, that he didn't have enough money for a ticket, but he captured a cat and was able to trade that cat for entrance in to see the circus. And what's important maybe from this writer's perspective anyway, is that that's not the... I really like cats, and it would never have occurred to me it would never occur to me personally to trade a cat to be eaten for admission to a circus. And this actor, Yankee Hill, in his autobiography, doesn't seem to think twice about that. I mean, he comes across, it's his autobiography, he comes across as a pretty nice guy. And he doesn't seem to have any regrets about giving that cat up like that. And, of course, when I read that, here I had this character who also is trying to present himself as a nice guy, thinks he's a nice guy, but who we should know, the reader should know, is not a good person. Yeah. And so I knew right off, as soon as I read that in Yankee Hill's autobiography, I knew right off that that was something Jeffrey Noonan had to do. And that was actually I would say it was a difficult scene for me to write, a difficult event for me to write, and also something I never would have written if not for the research. It never would have occurred to me to do that to a poor cat.
Yes, and I think that incident with the cat really strikes the reader as the first sign that there's really something troubling about the character of this charming figure, seemingly charming figure, Jeffrey Noonan. And that really leads into what I want to talk about next. There are so many funny and often violent and grisly stories along the way, but I do want to point out to our listeners that there is also a very serious thread running throughout this novel, and that is the story of Matthew Mulkey, alias Peter Pegg, who starts out as a decent, rather shy young man of 18, and through a series of unfortunate events, he's transformed into a pretty ruthless criminal. This is actually a theme throughout all of the novels of this series, and that interests me because, in the traditional Western novel or movie, and I'm thinking about works such as True Grit or The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and many others, the outlaw is simply presented as a force of evil, and we're not asked to consider how we might have gotten that way. But that seems to be an important question for you.
When I first started thinking about writing a Western, one of the first books I read as part of my research is a really fine, historically accurate, I think, book by Glenn Shirley called The Fighting Marlowes. And this is actually, the Marlowe brothers were very loosely the basis for the famous Hollywood Western, The Sons of Katie Elder. But what Glenn does is pretty carefully examine what was said and written about the Marlowes and the historical record. And it turns out it's not at all clear whether they were the thieves and killers that they were made out to be at the time. And from Glenn's perspective, it's quite possible that they were wrongly accused and subjected to quite a bit of hatred and violence. They were outsiders of a sort. They were travelers, never settling down in one place, and so naturally met with suspicion. And that idea of this injustice occurring that then kind of reverberates and causes more injustice and more violence really changed my whole idea about what justice is for. I don't anymore think that it's about somehow making things equal. I think justice, in the end, the purpose of justice is to short-circuit a cycle of violence that occurs when people take justice into their own hands.
I'd like you to read a short passage about an event that is critical in turning Mulkey from a starry-eyed wannabe Texas Ranger into a violent criminal. In this passage, Mulkey is being temporarily held in a jail cell on a journey to take him to the penitentiary where he's going to serve a long prison term for a murder that the reader knows he may very well be innocent of. This passage begins as the backstory of the one-armed warden of the jail where Mulkey is being held. And the reader should know that Mulkey's cellmate happens to be Jeffrey Noonan, a career criminal, a character who's got to be one of the most insidiously clever and manipulative outlaws in Western literature.
In November of 1861, Eldon Purdy, age 37, a cooper of small means, enlisted in the Texas Army. It was without undue difficulty that he was made into a soldier, and by all accounts a good one. In January of 1863, he fought bravely with Garland's brigade at the Battle of Arkansas Post, and was one of a few hundred rebel soldiers who managed to slip away when Confederate forces were overrun and surrendered to the Union. Finding himself alone and in unfamiliar country, he simply began to walk with no clear destination in mind, only the hope of finding a company of Secesh before the Yankees found him. 2 weeks later, half-starved, half-frozen, and with a festering gunshot wound to his left arm, he stumbled into a Confederate camp under the command of Lieutenant General Theophilus Granny Holmes. Purdy's injured arm was amputated below the elbow, and then, when painful abscesses that would not heal formed on the stump, amputated again above the elbow. The second amputation took, and Purdy was discharged and sent home to Waco. Having a wife, 3 children, and an invalid mother to support, and no longer able to work as a cooper, he applied for an invalid pension. In his application, he stated that his injury had been received when he was shot by a dead Yankee. Understandably, the War Department asked for further details, and Purdy supplied them. In his wanderings across Arkansas, Purdy explained, he was crossing a field on a bitter cold moonlit night when he came upon a deceased Union soldier holding a fine Colt Army revolver in his hand, a frozen finger still upon the trigger. Thinking the revolver might prove useful should he encounter a more lively version of his enemy, Purdy attempted to requisition the weapon for his own use, accidentally discharging it in the process, resulting in the wound to his arm. When the War Department denied Purdy's application for an invalid pension on the grounds that his injury was not received in the line of duty, he was thrown into despair. But both Mrs. Purdy's assured him that he was a good man and a righteous man, and the Lord would provide if the War Department would not. They were proved right. It was a joyous day in the Purdy household indeed when Eldon was able to report to his wife, mother, and children that he'd found gainful employment as the county jailer. Purdy could not hold a gun and open the door of the jail cell at the same time, so it was his habit at mealtimes to give the keys to the cook and hold a pistol at the ready as the cook unlocked the door to the cell and handed dinner pails to the imprisoned. Jeffrey took his pail, turned his back on Purdy, let go the pail, drew a pistol, spun around, and shot Purdy between the eyes before the pail hit the floor of the cell. Noonan and Mulkey locked the cook in the cell and quickly and quietly removed themselves from the jailhouse. Doubtless the reader will understand me perfectly when I say that, surely, any man with a particle of decency in him will not disparage, but rather applaud, Noonan and Mulkey's actions, and thank them heartily for launching into the hereafter such pretenders to the throne of justice as Eldon Purdy.
Without giving too much away, I do want to say that the fates of Matthew Mulkey, alias Peter Pegg, and Jeffrey Noonan seem to be sealed at the end of the novel, but you do leave the door just slightly ajar at the end. And so as a fan of the series, I have to ask, is there any chance we may hear from either one of them again in a novel or a story?
Oh, absolutely not. Like Earnshaw, I'm done, probably. And though it has occurred to me that I've got a 10,000 word start on a story about a preacher.
Okay, well, it's been quite a run. Again, the novel is Peter Pegg, Outlaw, by One Who Knew Him, by Jonathan Eaton. That's available on Amazon Books in both Kindle and paperback editions. And I should mention that both versions include marvelous illustrations by the Texas artist Tom Sale. I encourage you to download the sample, and I dare you to read it without feeling compelled to find out what happens next. And you can find out more on about Jonathan Eaton's novels and also read some of his marvelous short stories, some of which feature the same characters that you come across in Peter Pegg and the other Outlaw novels of the trilogy on Jonathan's website, corylluspress.com. That's CORYLUS press.com. This has been Verbal Exchange. My name is Steve Eaton, and I invite you to check out my blog, The Garden of Eaton, at Garden of Eaton, that's one word, gardenofeaton.home.blog. Goodbye.
Jesse had a wife to mourn for his life. 3 children, they were brave. But the mean little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave. Jesse went to his rest with his hand upon his breast. The devil may be upon his knee. He was born one day in the county of Clay and came of a solitary race. Oh, Jesse had a wife to mourn for his life. 3 children, they were brave. But this mean little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave. This song was made by Billy Gashade as soon as the news it did arrive. He said there was no man with the law in his hand could take Jesse James when alive. Poor Jesse had a wife to mourn for his life. 3 children, they were brave. But this mean little coward that shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave.